apologise first off for the blurb. I panicked and sent in the first thing I thought of when Mike asked me for something to describe my talk.
No change there then.
No change there then. The reality is this is a reprise of a talk I gave around the same time last year entitled Here Come the Robots, along the theme of what would happen to capitalism if it succeeded essentially in developing technology sufficiently that it could eliminate the need for human labour and the consequences for the working class and the possibilities of that sort of eventuality coming about. This time I'm going to go into slightly more detail in areas, so it's not going to be the same talk, but it is on roughly that same theme. So I'm going to begin with a brief explanation of the brief and where we're going to go with this talk. Then we're going to examine capitalism and a key feature of the essence and the definition of capitalism that is very often missed when people think about or discuss it. And then we're going to look in very great detail at the way in which surplus value is divided across the system of capitalism as a whole. And from there, the effects of the continual improvement and refinement of the means of production and the consequent cheapening of commodities. And then we're going to examine the ways in which technology, despite this apparent self-contradictory role, continues to drive its own development and the effects that this has on working class and particularly on the labour market. I'm then going to come to the core part of the talk and discuss Werner Winger and the notion of the technological singularity. From there, I'm going to look at some of what we could talk about, the early stage evidence that such an eventuality is occurring now, and look at the sort of predicted and predictable effects of such an eventuality in the short run. I'm then going to look at some features of capitalism that might retard or prevent a technological singularity and more or less save the system as it stands. And then I'm going to have a small correction, because somewhere in the planning of this talk I completely forgot to mention socialism, and so the title is entirely misleading and it should really have been Capitalism and Singularity. I'll see what I can do in some hastily scribbled notes at the very end. If any of you edit Wikipedia at all and try and edit the capitalism page, you'll see that it's haunted by a definition of capitalism that comes from various types of dictionaries and essentially says the private ownership of the means of production, or the non-state ownership, as an awful lot of American editors try and have. And I've tried to point the editors in the direction of the Oxford English Dictionary, because it has a wonderful definition of capitalism. And I forgot to copy it out, but it is along the lines of a system that promotes or allows the interests of capitalists. And that's just such a nice and concise way of looking at it, because it gets away from this whole silly notion that if the state owns it, it's not capitalism. That definition brings forward the key idea of capitalism, that it is about the ownership of capital, and it is all about the rewarding of the ownership of capital. And that the idea that a lot of anti-globalization types and a lot of leftists and a lot of green movement types and fair traders, that it's all about the trading system and it's unfair trade and this sort of thing, when the reality is that exploitation occurs at the point of the existence of capital, and it is a system that rewards the ownership of capital and it divides the wealth out accordingly. So this is important because it features very strongly in the ideology that capitalism throws up. When I was given the brief for this talk, I was told that other people were going to deal with the ecological crisis, that other people were going to deal with other features of capitalism, so I wasn't going to, that's not to deal with that side of things. I said that's fine for my talk. I'm going to assume that we can seed the seas with iron filings to promote algae growth. We can create carbon capture trees that will put the carbon CO2 into deep storage. We'll put a disk in the upper stratosphere that will help cool the world down with a a massive shadow. We'll turn the Nevada and Sahara deserts into massive solar panel farms. We'll have a hydrogen economy that will ship hydrogen around the world, and capitalism will go on as if there is no ecological crisis because there will be a technological fix. That is what I'm assuming. It's what George Bush assumed could happen. He kept saying, we'll fix it with technology. And it's what capitalism as an idea essentially wants to believe. Because the point of capitalism is that there is a limitless possibility in the development of capital. And this stems back initially to the very heart of the situation, which is the primitive hoard of money. Because money, as we know, it has no use value other than as exchange value, and there is no limit to what you can buy with money except saved by the amount of money that you have. So if you want to have more things, you only need more money. And this comes to the very heart of the capitalist ideology, that there is no limit to what money can do. There is no limit to production, and that we can just keep on pushing things in an eternal cycle of progress. Now, the way in which capitalism essentially rewards the ownership of capital, Marx looked at in a term he referred to as, and I'm going to probably get chopped down in flames by older and wiser party members over this section of the talk, he called the organic composition of capital, which is the ratio of the value of capital to the value of labour. And what he found was he was looking at the system as a whole. He was saying, well, if we assume an equal rate of exploitation across all the various different industries and capitals of the world, if we assume that there are varying amounts of labour in the various products, then what we would find is that across the system there would be uneven rates of profit. That different capitalists would make more profit in more labour-intensive areas than they would in less labour-intensive areas and capital-heavy areas. And now this conflicted with the real-world knowledge, which was that competition among capitals tends to equalise the rate of profit, because if someone sees that someone's making mega profits doing one thing, they'll all pile in and start doing that same thing themselves to get a share of that profit. So it's quite clear that it can't be that things are selling at the value. There has to be some mechanism by which value is changed into price, and the value of the labour performed is transferred out among the various capital. So what he suggested was that goods are not sold at their value, they're sold at a price of production plus the prevailing rate of profit. So if everything sells at the same 5% markup, what you'll find is that those heavy industries that are capital heavy will receive a transfer of surplus value from the more labour intensive parts of the economy. Now this is clearly they're still making the same profit rates, but what you would see is that there is a more absolute massive profit, that there is more money to be made in capital intensive industries, and this is historically you can see in things like agriculture. Agriculture massively labour intensive, very low capital intensity until very recently, and very low rates of return for the labourers and for the farmers. And yet, if you have any sort of heavy industry, that adds value. You look at food, raw produce quite cheap. It goes to McCain's, it becomes McCain's oven chips. Suddenly much more expensive because they've had to employ the capital of their chip making plant in order to increase the amount of money that they're going to make from it. The way that Uncle Charlie explained this, so far as profits are concerned, the various capitalists are just so many stockholders in a stock company in which the shares of profit are uniformly divided per 100. So the profits differ in case in the individual capitalists only in accordance with the amount of capital invested by each in the aggregate enterprise, i.e. according to his investment in social production as a whole, according to the number of his shares. So the effect of this really is that in capitalism there is a distinct incentive to work towards, on the one hand, sparing labour as much as possible, and on the other hand, using and deploying as much capital as possible. And the contest is not about, certainly in the minds of the capitalists, it's not about how many people they can get working for them. It is about how much capital they can have working for them. Because to their mind, the way it appears is that if I have 10 billions in capital, then I will have even more money coming in than if I only had a small amount of capital. And that's the place for the competition to occur. Now, of course, that means that there is an inherent incentive within this system to try and change what Marx termed the technical composition of capital, which is the actual mass of machinery to labour, to try and find new methods, new technologies, new ways of producing, so that you can actually produce the same good, possibly at a greater rate of profit than your rival, because you've got a new technology, you've got a new way of doing things, you've stolen one beat on the other side. So we've got two sort of processes. One is the competition for a bit of extra profit, and the other is the general principle that capital is the way to get reward within the system. And this is driving technological change. And if you ally that with the notion that you can do an infinity of things with money, then you can do an infinity of things with technology. And technology, and the ideology of capitalism, will solve all ills. Technology will get us out of any mess because there's always a way to fix things. But there's a consequence for this ever-raising of the technological barrier, which is if you are constantly improving and refining production, then you find yourself absolutely lowering the cost of commodities. Because if you use less and less labour in all your given commodities across the system, you will lower their prices in the end. Now, on the one hand, this can be very useful for the capitalists if they manage to selectively lower the price of the goods that are consumed by labour, and therefore lower the absolute real cost of labour, and their capital remains the same. That for them is a big win. If they can cut the price of food, if they can cut the price of housing, if they can cut down the value of labour power, then that means that they will have managed to raise the organic composition of capital, and there'll be a higher value component of capital to that of labour. But of course, the other way around is if the commodity value of capital starts to fall rapidly compared to labour, then that means that we'll be taking home a bigger share than they are, and they are unlikely to like that. So, even if they are managing to maintain the same ratio, the problem is that if they manage to reduce these costs on both sides, then what they will have is absolutely less profit per capital in the immediate terms. So, does that mean that there is an inherent limitation on the capacity of capitalism to drive technology forward? We can look at, I'm thinking mostly for the purpose of this talk in terms of the computer industry, because that is one of the bleeding edge technologies and one of the most obvious examples of technology being driven forward. But this more or less holds true, because if you start to reduce absolutely the amounts of each capital, what you will still be able to do is have an absolute mass of lots of different capitals. So if you've cheapened the cost of a computer program, but what you also get, because each computer program is cheap, you will have more computer programs overall, and you'll still have an absolute mass of capital. It's just that you'll have each individual unit of property will now be smaller. But a large firm can still manage to lay stake to a large amount of technology. I mean, there is the possibility, the example exists of the open source movement and the open software movement as an example of what has happened. The point is that computer programming has reached the point where the capital involved in creating a new computer application is so low, and the cost of the labour is so low, that people actually are prepared to give it away. They're better to say, well, actually, I can't physically exploit this product. I'm just going to let it go out there into the wilderness and let people have it. That could be seen as an after effect of this lowering of the absolute values involved in these things. But there is also, we can make the comparison with how the party used to explain the price of gold. People used to say to us, well, look, gold can't have value. Any idiot could walk off into the wilderness and find a nugget of gold. And we would say, yes, of course, that idiot who just wandered off will be immediately rich after very little effort indeed of finding that lump of gold. But what you have to take into account is all the other idiots who never find any other gold, and all the massive labour that gets put into looking for gold as an aggregate across the system simply gets rewarded in the lucky finds of a tiny few. And even if we continue with this idea of, the computer programs cost nothing, labour programming costs next to nothing, there's just this massive built up dead labour that now makes it really easy to use, all this sort of thing. There's still a very real economy of engineering new microchips, of building the hardware infrastructure, of putting together the design and application of new pieces of machinery that you can run the very cheap and easy software on. And of course, there's no coincidence that people like Apple these days, what they're trying to do is they're trying to build up application ecosystems. They want you to buy their platform that will then run a myriad of very easy to obtain applications and pieces of software, but essentially you're still buying their platform and they can still make a bit of a cut on the mass of applications and programs that are available through that system. So, if technology can be bad for the owners of technology, it can also be even worse for the workers. And in history, we've seen many times that what happens is a new technology comes along and it just drives out whole industries and whole groups of workers find themselves made redundant. I cited this talk last time, and I think that the image that he used, if I had used PowerPoint, this would have been a great moment for a slide, is quite apposite. Robin Hanson wrote in the IEEE Spectrum special issue on Singularity, an article called The Economics of Singularity. And what he suggests is that there is, if you like, imagine an island complex or a coastline with various rocks and peaks and levels in it. And the rising waterline represents the level at which robots, technology, computerization and mechanization can surpass the capacity of humans to work. Now, if you happen to be working in an industry that's low down on the shoreline, very easily you will find yourself overtaken by technology and made redundant. But there will still be peaks and places that will be very hard for the rising tide of technology to reach. And the example he gives is that whereas the advent of the Ford Motor Works and the production line there that put saddle makers out of business, it proved highly lucrative for engineers, designers, and those types of workers who still remained behind because they were still there and still capable of commanding a high price on the market for their particular capacities. So, whilst rising technology can be bad in some instances, in many other people it can be beneficial. But the key distinction between those saddle makers and the designers is that we have reached a point that human thought can't be replicated by machine. That's kind of the big dividing line. There's a whole lot of us, a lot of occupations, tasks that rely intensely upon a human being being able to think. And if a machine could replace that, then you have to be hard pressed to find work that you actually need a human to do. And this brings us on to the notion of the singularity itself. It's this one here. The kind of classic paper. I don't have the title on it. That's not very clever, is it? It's by a guy called Werner Winger, and it was written in 1993. And it was this is the kind of the one that people tend to cite as being the keystone to the singularitarian idea. And basically, his suggestion was that he'd be very surprised if before 2005 or after 2030 that the acceleration of technological process had reached a point of the imminent creation of technology of entities with greater than human intelligence. That was what he was looking at. So that sometime between 5 years ago and in 25 years, superhuman intelligence will be created. And one of the key underlying premises that people cite regarding this coming technology is something called Moore's law, which is that the number of transistors that can be placed inexpensively on an integrated circuit has doubled approximately every 2 years. And this has held since about 1953 and is projected to keep on holding at current development rates until about 2015. So every 2 years, Now, this doesn't represent a doubling of actual computer capacity, but it does represent significant leaps in computer processing power about every 2 years. And also, some people have pointed out that really it could well be that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because someone said this will happen every 2 years.
Exactly.
Various companies have then turned around and gone, well, we have to try and aim for about a 2-year cycle. But the fact that it has held is the significant point, that every 2 years, processors just get better and better and better. This is projected to go on into the future. Finger identified 3 or 4 on this version vectors by which these superhuman intelligences might emerge. Now, the first one is the obvious, which is that we will create artificial intelligence, that we will create software models of a human mind that were capable of replicating a human mind and performing like one, and that would basically one day awake. The other is a sort of digital Gaia, which is that large computer networks and their associated users might suddenly find that they are better than they are an individual human. And then in some circumstances, I mean, some people, the idea of Wikipedia as being the wisdom of the crowd and a creative commons is kind of a more or less a version of that, that Wikipedia is smarter than all of us individually. And of course, nowadays when people, it's strange when I'm away from a computer keyboard myself, I don't have a fancy iPhone or anything like that. And someone asks me a question, I think, well, I don't have a computer, I'll just check out on Wikipedia. I've downloaded my memory to the internet, so I don't need to know anything anymore. As Simon heard earlier on this evening when I tried to spend about 20 minutes remembering a small fact. So that's one other vector. And the third, he has 2 here in this version, but it kind of gets resolved down to 1. Human-computer interfaces become so intimate that users might reasonably be considered superhumanly intelligent. So we're talking cybernetics, computer implants, or just being so dependent on having an iPhone in your pocket that you constantly consult it for the basic thoughts and ideas, that you become an enhanced cyborg entity. And of course, biological science might provide us with the means to improve human intellect as well through genetic or other chemical engineering. He quotes a fellow I.J. Good, writing in the 1960s. Let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. Since the design of machines is one of these intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then be, unquestionably, an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. That's the prognosis of what the technological singularity means. Some people have been known to question whether this exponential explosion of intelligence will happen, or even could happen. I mean, we are having to ask the question, can computers reach that sort of level of capacity? But even if we don't accept the maximum program, what the science fiction author Ken MacLeod calls the rapture of the nerds, where there's an intelligence explosion of singularity, and we all upload our consciousnesses onto computers and live forever. Even if we don't accept that, what we can look at is the sort of like the weak singularity, which is those stages leading up to the point at which computers become ever progressively smarter, we become relatively dumber, and more dependent upon this sort of capacity for our lives. I looked for an example of the creeping coming of the singularity, and I thought that there was a good example from 1997, which was when Garry Kasparov, arguably, and argued the world's greatest ever chess player, an argument you can have from another time, was defeated in a tournament by Deep Blue. Now, that a computer was capable of playing better chess than the best chess player who's ever lived. Now, it's actually, I went and read a couple of bits about that game. And what was interesting was that Deep Blue actually had a human team that was tweaking his algorithms between games whenever they noticed him doing something mad or stupid or suboptimal. So at this point, Deep Blue is still a tool in the hands of human controllers. And the other thing that they mentioned was that Garry Kasparov himself is in the habit, apparently, of playing against chess computers in order to, or was, because he's retired now, to practice and improve his game. That was their summation, which is a very interesting feature. Now, of course, that means in real terms, what we're talking about, the technological singularity, Deep Blue is not it. If Deep Blue was capable of learning from its mistakes and from tweaking its own algorithms, that would be the point at which we would say that an artificial intelligence had taken off. But it was still, in world historical computing terms, still quite a significant moment. I mean, Garry Kasparov alleges that they cheated and refuses to accept that he was actually fairly beaten. But, you don't get that sort of job without the ego to match. But the interesting thing, in reading a different book about chess, unrelated to this talk, by John Nunn, it was a set of chess puzzles. And what he did was he took a series of games in the 1920s, and he subjected them to the sort of analysis that a modern chess game gets. And what he found was that some of the greatest chess players in the world at the time, Najdorf and Capablanca and the like, made stinking errors that you would not expect of a grandmaster playing at the top level today. And I thought that was very interesting, particularly as what he was talking about was he was going home himself, John Nunn, and he is feeding chess positions into a computer to extrapolate them out to find the optimal lines. What it looks like, I mean, I can't prove that it would take a serious amount of sociology or psychology or university funding, but I would just float the possibility that what we're looking at is that modern chess players are playing in an age in which their games can be subject to computer analysis, in which they can test themselves against computers, and as a consequence have actually improved their game based on the experience of having to compete in that sort of environment. I mean, so that's possibly an example of a different sort of early stage of the singularity, which is that our brains are being improved by human-computer interaction. I just thought I'd throw out some evidence and some possibilities of what the creeping singularity looks like. Some of the effects of the early stages. In the 1980s, a group of, I should have checked the title of the book, there's a book about the McDonaldization process, which is that in the name of liberating us, in fact, we're being deeply inconvenienced. So whereas before, 100 years ago, before Woolworths invented self-service from the shelf, you'd have gone into a shop and someone would have gone and fetched things for you and then you'd walked out with the goods. Or more recently, before McDonald's, you'd have gone into the cafe, sat down, and a serving person would have come to your table, taken your order and bought you your food and goods. And then what happens in McDonaldization is they say, well, we're going to make life easier for you. You can stand in a queue, you can feel pressurized to list your order from the board, and then wait here while we fetch the food to you. You can go away and eat somewhere outside of our cafe because there's no room for you to eat in here. It's just too expensive to have tables. And this process is continuing. Nowadays, it's continuing to the point where you go to the supermarket, and I'm fond of them myself. You have the self-service machines. Of course, self-service, in reality, is putting the burden of you checking out the cost of the supermarket's goods onto you. You're doing what they would previously have paid someone else to do for them, and you're doing them a favour. It's not a benefit for you to have to pay for these things. But that is only possible because they've now got computerized technology that is capable of providing the security that the human once provided, and of being able to reliably price the goods as you mark them up and ready to send them out. And it's called disintermediation. And in my own field of work, in librarianship, disintermediation is the buzzword. And of course, what it also means is that now they're putting self-issue machines in libraries and getting rid of staff. So we are experiencing the joys. And this is now moving on to libraries, very clearly a service sector, but also an intellectual service sector where computerization has led to what you could call some de-skilling and some redundancy. So, to come back to this model of ever-increasing distributions concentrated capital. And this is kind of trying to look forward to how I think things could shape up in the immediate future in capitalism, if it remains. course, Marx's model of this transformation of surplus value into prices is a great deal of an abstraction. I mean, he even says, he's assuming away short-term fluctuations in the rate of profit and assuming away various other items. But we can look to some that will retard this ever-decreasing value of capital. Now, the first one, this is something that Marx doesn't really cover in very great detail, is taxes. In the most obvious way, if you put a tax on labour, that means that the price of labour has gone up, and so therefore this amount of surplus value from labour-intensive industries going to capital-intensive will be diminished because some of that extra surplus value is now being appropriated as taxes. Now, taxes could possibly be seen as a form of what he refers to as absolute rent. And absolute rent differs from differential rent. Differential rent is based on being able to produce over and above the prevailing productiveness of the general economy, usually in agriculture by having overproductive land. But he says absolute rent is just basically you've got a monopoly, you can charge what you like for the goods. So that's what taxes are. And so but the important point about taxes is that there's another type of absolute rent that exists out there, which is copyright. And because if we're talking about further developments in technology, then the owners of the copyrights are going to be the ones who benefit the most. And what I would suggest is if we get to this point where we have this intelligence explosion, we have this intense explosion in productivity of design, of new technologies, then what's going to have to happen is that various owners of capital, the people who own the means of thinking now, because obviously the thoughts of computers are property, so their ideas belong to their owners, they will have to take on and defend their copyrights as a means of protecting their profits and protecting the profitability of capitalism. So what I'm suggesting is that there might be this conflict between the use of the state to try and extract surplus value from all this productive work as taxes, and either buy off the workers as some sort of lumpen proletariat and have an aristocracy of the bureaucracy of the state, or a similar sort of aristocracy might emerge through the control of the copyrights and the rents, the intangible fixed assets arising out of this new computer-driven design. And I look to historical examples. I don't think this is actually that new territory for capitalism. And what I'm thinking is along the lines of what happened with the railway barons, which is that they made vast profits chiefly out of swindling, but out of being able to lay claim to the virgin territory, to just vast tracts of basically worthless and empty land, on the basis that one day a train line might run through it. And that's kind of the way I'm thinking that this effect might have, is that the people who can kind of lay claim to vast tracts of copyrights and new ideas, and of course who will have a super intelligent artificial intelligence lawyer on their side to fight their case because they won't need human lawyers anymore, is the zone of the fight over the remaining surplus value coming in from the rest of the economy. That's not a pretty picture because most of us become kind of surplus to requirements and end up living in something like what we already can see are mega slums that exist across South America and large chunks of the world. And of course, that could easily come here if we are no longer even needed as consumers. So that's some fairly scary prospects that could come about as a consequence of this. I mean, the ultimate scary one, obviously, in singularitarian literature, is that the super intelligent computers decide that they don't need us and destroy the world to turn it into a bigger computer. Let's leave that one off the chart for now. So, coming to a close, sort of, this is the correction part. You've noticed I've not mentioned socialism yet. Well, what is there to say? I mean, the point is that, first off, again, to reiterate what I said in the previous version of this talk, here on the robots, advancing technology does not need to do away with the need for a political movement for socialism. We can't rely on the technology alone to create a world of common ownership and the satisfaction of our mutual needs. Quite the contrary, I think we'll have to fight that bit harder. But some prospects that we could look to. Could the superhuman intelligences resolve the economic calculation problem for us overnight? I mean, are we looking at a point where we can just turn around and go, look, really, we will just leave it to the computer? And in that case, are we setting ourselves up for a situation in which socialism will only be possible because of this sort of advanced technology? Or would we find ourselves becoming like, children in the garden of the gods, where the fast folk, the supercomputers, are doing whatever it is they do and they just leave us free to roam wild? But the point, I'd say, is that we do not need to rely on getting this technology to have socialism. We have the productive capacity now. So the point is that what we will have to think about is, how would socialism deal with this sort of advancing technology? Is it that socialism would simply put a stop to it? Because we would have a situation where some of the drivers that Werner Winke, he says he identifies interstate competition and interpersonal competition as being so overwhelmingly, drivingly powerful that nothing could stop a hard lift-off singularity. Or would it be that we would decide, well, actually what we want is to have fast computers running the world for us? So just to recap, what I've tried to do first off is look at how capitalism is a system that rewards the ownership of capital first and foremost. I've tried to look at and explain, possibly poorly, how this operates in the here and now, and then looked at how the drive for technological innovation has created a situation in which there's the outside possibility that it might choke off further technological innovation, and then I've tried to look at various ways in which that can be itself negated. I've then looked at what would happen to human labour if we have superhuman intelligence that can replace this quintessentially human part of our work, and then I've tried to give you a very, very distilled version of what a singularity in this sense means. And then I've looked at, just briefly, the evidence of some of the sort of weak singularity that may be already occurring and that's already heading towards the big one in the end. And then I've looked at some further features of the real world and then some of the sort of perspective fights that we might see about the emergent singularity. And very, very briefly, and scribbled in green ink, I've looked at how a singularity might affect socialism. Thank you very much.